and I'll wait for the recording. And yeah, so debate strategy. Debate strategy is a really interesting topic to talk about because everyone has a really different conception of it. And what I find very often is that strategy seminars often tend to be extremely, extremely unproductive because strategy in debating is not like strategy in any other type of activity or sport. People try to condense into very formulaic structures, but that's just not how debating actually works because you can't really have one universal formula, one size fits all kind of general, like grand idea of strategy that lets you just win debates, right? So we're going to give you a really like realistic conception of what strategy is in debating. So there are two misconceptions I want to clear up to establish before we begin like the rest of the presentation. The first is to really quickly establish that strategy is not specific, guys. Strategy is very broad. It's a framework, or I like to consider it a mindset that you apply or try to apply in the vast majority or all circumstances that you'll find yourself in debating. So there's not one strategy, for example, when you find yourself in a very hyper specific situation and say, I study this specific strategy. I'm going to employ plan like Z or something like that. And like, now you have like the proper way to like do the extension or do like the refutation. That's just not how it works, right? Debating is always going to be varying in terms of what strategies you need to apply and what mix of strategies you need to apply every single time you do a round. So it's just not productive to try to box yourself into specific frameworks of how to deal with like certain arguments or make certain cases. Because if anything, I find when you try to do that, it really, really limits speakers and their potential to do very well in debating. Um, I find, at least like for me, like anecdotally, I guess, there's a period of time where I tried to like do like the hyper specific strategy game and like, try to apply specific circumstances to a broad set of circumstances that I found myself in. And just doing that just wasn't helpful for my debating at all. It didn't really help me improve because I wasn't really actively thinking about what I was doing wrong. I was just trying to prematurely fit things into a specific box that I've set into like what I thought debating was. But it also just meant that like I just didn't do very well in debate rounds because it meant that I limited myself or confined myself to what I considered to be the formula to win in that specific scenario. So I found I was able to achieve a lot greater successes in debating once I've kind of broken out that mold and done a much more broad or generalized conception of what strategy is to me. The second thing is debate is not a good faith activity. Okay, and what's important to for you to understand in debate, or to, at least if your goal is to improve and to win things in debate, in my opinion, is to acknowledge that debating is not an activity where you're trying to actually debate, where you're trying to debate ideas and come to like the best conclusions and stuff like that. Debating fundamentally is a sport. Debating is a game, and the goal of that game, at least the way that I like to look at it, is the goal for you is to sell a case that is interesting and intuitive enough for the judges to repeat to other judges and themselves. Because fundamentally, and like this is like something that I see all the time from like debaters, and like I am guilty of this as well, is I will often complain like, wow, the judge didn't remember this specific line of analysis that I said. The judge didn't like remember like how this specifically weighed up against like what the other team specifically said, stuff like that, right? And obviously that's going to happen, right? It's like a 50-minute thing. People are going to be talking for like a long time. The judge is going to be taking notes as fast as they can. They're not going to remember specifically what you said. So what you're trying to sell to a judge is not specific lines of analysis, but you're trying to sell a general case line that you can intuitively have them buy through those lines of analysis. And you have to make it intuitive and accessible enough for a judge to be able to repeat to themselves or other judges. And this frame of mind is really important to improve in debating, or at least to get the results that you want to get in debate. Because if you think about it this way, when judges determine who wins or loses, or when I guess you think when you consider when like debates are like won or lost, they're not won or lost in like out in the ether, right? They're won or lost based on one person trying to convince a panel of people or just themselves of certain ideas being stronger than other ideas, right? And I'm sure all of you guys who have judged in high school tournaments would know this very well, or just any university tournament would know this very well, that, you know, judging is basically you trying to convince either other people, yourself, that certain ideas are easy to convey in an RFD, or easier or more intuitively easy to weigh up against one another, right? So knowing that is really important, because now you can understand the specific things that you can have to say to be able to convince a judge that you won. Because the reason why oftentimes people tend to get really surprised for like by calls and stuff like that is that they can't fathom that that they would lose, given the case that they know that they ran. However, the reason why, for example, when I'm debating with my partner, for example, so like oftentimes with Vidit, I'll say, "Hey, man, I think we lost that round," and then he'll be like, "Well, what do you mean? Like, our case was clearly very good. Like, we said really smart things." And I said, "Yeah, I agree with you, but I'm just weighing this debate on how the judge will perceive certain cases, and not about what was actually said." And more often than not, like, not to brag, because like, when I do that, like, I oftentimes lose, but like, not to brag, but I'm usually correct on that, right? And the reason why I found myself to be correct in how I can determine how judges make their calls is that I've now accepted that what I think really doesn't matter. It's about how well I'm able to sell a case to a panel of judges. So being able to shift your mindset from thinking you want to debate to understanding how it is you're able to convince a judge or another person of the merits of your case is something that's really important for you if you want to get better in debate. Okay. Let's go to the next slide. So, what is my strategy then? You might be wondering. It's very simple, and it's just a general mindset that I like to establish. And I think this is the far easiest way to do well in debating, um, at least in comparison to like trying to fit debating into a mold of strategies and the specific like contingency plans that you want to create for yourself, based on like what other people say. Because debating itself, again, is a game that you need to train your muscle memory on. And that only really comes when you're able to have a general um, mindset or strategy you're able to apply in the vast majority of circumstances. So I like to condense this mindset then, at least for me, into two questions. Is my case impactful enough? Sorry, my coughing. And the second is my case relevant enough? And what this means is everything you say should be deliberate to achieve two specific goals. It should, one, establish your case as either impactful, or the second is to establish your case as relevant. And you're trying to strike a balance between these two because, for example, not all case lines are going to be as impactful relative to others. So, for example, other teams might have more impactful cases than you, but you might be able to win on the fact that you're more relevant, and the same being like vice versa, right? So you're trying to strike a balance between these two, but everything you say, regardless of like what line of analysis it is, should always be trying to achieve these goals, right? Even if it's like the first few sentences of your introduction, it should be trying to achieve these two goals. Because oftentimes when I find people debating is they waste a lot of time on uncontested arguments at the beginning of the round, like for like the purposes of framing or whatever, and they sacrifice a lot of their efficiency in that regard. And by virtue of that, it really sacrifices the ability for the judge to see your cases intuitively more impactful or more relevant than other people's cases. And like this factors in some like rhetorical stuff as well, which is hard for me to like properly include in a seminar, because a lot of this stuff is going to be based on like my own observations and how I feel about certain things, rather than really thought out formulaic answers to things or like phenomena in debating that I've observed. So like as an example, right, if you want to like waste like a minute or at least like 20 seconds or so on an uncontested argument by establishing, oh, this group of people are so oppressed, this group, blah 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 blah, we need to like help these people. No one's going to contest that argument, right? And even though the rest of your case might be good, what's important to remember as well is that even if you've spent that, even, sorry, what's important to remember is that you, by virtue of you spending like even 10 seconds or 20 seconds on that like introduction on an like uncontested argument to establish some level of like impact, um, the ability for other teams to kind of just like wave away like that one large impact with like a one liner by saying, well, that's not relevant, this is symmetrical, even if not theoretically should be impactful for your case, if the rest of your case is good enough, When you're selling it to a judge, it makes your case seem and be perceived as a lot less strong than it actually is. So, perception is the number one thing that you should be considering when you're debating in the first place, as the first important note of like your debating strategy. So, don't waste time on your arguments that will not be contested. That's not productive for your time. So, let's go into an example of what this actually means. This is an example that was ran at the at Nautic, and it's basically this house supports the narrative that all wealth accumulation is immoral. And from the start, the government team from OG basically characterized like the exploitation of workers in the global south. They talked about corporate malpractice and exploitation, a lot of impactful things like the um, enabling of sweatshop labor and stuff like that. And they started talking about some of the impacts about public policy changes, how you get higher taxes on their side now when you have this narrative that all wealth accumulation is immoral because you're more likely to be stringent on like billionaires and like rich people, yada, 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 corporations. You have tighter regulations, better labor policy in response. Sorry. I think it's like the side effects of like the vaccine. They're like kind of lingering, but it's just like a small cough at the end of the day. Anyways, yeah, so it seems like a very intuitively impactful case. The judge might see this and be like, "Wow, this is like a lot of good, impacts from this. We have good characterization of like exploitation of works in the global south. This is all indeed done by billionaires. Maybe we should support that all wealth accumulation is immoral, or like the narrative that all wealth accumulation is immoral." There's a couple of problems from this, and I'll be talking about my case from the closing opposition team. So basically, on closing opposition, myself and Joanne at the time, basically thought of this case. So the first thing to establish is that this is a debate that exists on the margins, and notably here, what I'm doing is trying to satisfy the question that I always ask myself in the previous slide, which is, how do I establish relevancy in the debate? What can I say as a closing team to make sure that we stay relevant, or put other teams out of relevance in the round? This is how I do it. Firstly, acknowledging that this is a debate that exists on the margins. What this is saying is that this debate is very marginal, tangible, like real world policy impacts, for example. And that's the first thing I wanted to establish, right? I said, speaker, narrative level debates, this house supports a narrative that all wealth accumulation is immoral. Narrative level debates don't really have broad sweeping policy impacts. And then you can characterize why, right? You can talk about how there are so many reasons for why wealth redistribution policy is the way that it is, talking about how there's a lot of material interests and special interests at play that influence public policy, like lobbying and stuff like that. You can talk about how governments, for example, already actively enable like immoral mainstream practices. Like, for example, like we kind of already agree, like in a mainstream sense, that sweatshop labor and like child labor is like obviously bad in the global south. But this has not done nothing to stop governments or to even curtail governments from engaging that practice. If anything, in recent years, these practices have gotten worse and worse over time as more companies and corporations have outsourced their labor to like the global south, right? So basically, what this means is that the narrative of whether wealth accumulation is immoral literally has no impact on public policy whatsoever. So this is basically saying that even if we have or accept government's conception of the world and say that this is the narrative that everyone kind of supports, right? Just because you say something is immoral, just because everyone agrees something is immoral, doesn't mean that that has any impact whatsoever on public policy. So government teams need to establish why these two has even a correlative relationship, much less causal relationship. But they haven't done that. I don't think they personally can do that. So that's really important. And what this does here is, one, this establishes CO as a very relevant team in this debate, because what this means is that arguments that they make to the effect of the impacts that like this narrative has on people is going to be different from what we got here in terms of policy impacts. Meaning then that it's probably the case that once you establish this, that CO is going to give more relevant arguments to the debate. And the second thing that this does is that it pushes teams out of relevance. So thinking about debate as like a tension between or a pull between different teams of trying to stay more relevant than the other, is also a really important thing to think about, because as you increase your own relevance in this debate, and like I'm not saying relevance is necessarily like a zero sum game, because there are exceptions, but thinking like generally speaking it as a zero sum game is really helpful, right? Because as we bring closing opposition into more relevance, we begin to push out teams like opening government, right? Because as we start to characterize, frame, and establish why we are relevant because of the fact that policy impacts don't really exist as a result of like narrative level debates, this necessarily means that teams like government who hinge their cases on policy impacts, and like these large sweeping impacts, become less relevant over time as well, insofar as able to make this case very well. So that's why this is really important. And that's the first part to my strategy, I guess, if there even is one, about trying to bring myself into relevance and saying things that are relevant to the round. The second is talking about where this debate does exist. So this is kind of a continuation of the relevance question, but this, as you can see, starts to bring in the idea of impact, right? How can I establish myself as more impactful than the others? Or how can I strike the perfect balance between relevance and impact? What we can say in closing opposition is say, this debate exists on the individual level and how individual people who choose to engage in wealth accumulation view their own actions. So you might be wondering, like Tyler, obviously individual level impacts are much smaller than policy impacts. So how are you weighing over them? The first obviously is like the obvious answer, which is, again, you're striking a balance between relevance and impact. But more importantly as well, you can think about it this way, right? If you're able to prove that you are more likely to get individual level impacts onto people than broad policy impacts, this still satisfies the idea of establishing impact in the debate, right? Because what this means is these impacts become extremely unimpactful, because they're only impactful in name only. Because if they're not going to happen, these impacts really, really don't matter. And they become quite irrelevant and unimportant in the round. So if anything, you're still establishing a high level of impact relative to other teams, because you're explaining why your impacts are just more likely to happen and why theirs are unlikely to happen in the first place. So, anyways, as a continuation of this, so we talked about how this is a debate about how people understand their actions within the broader system that their actions exist in, right? Because if this is a narrative debate, this is just about like how you perceive things, how you perceive the actions of yourself, and how you perceive the actions of others. And that's the extent to which this debate can exist in. And what this does is what this part does is that it achieves two things. The first, like I just said, it establishes impact relative to other teams. And the second is it further continues the idea of pushing out of other teams out of relevance and bringing yourself into relevance, right? Because this way you confine the debate to a very hyper specific section of which of which impacts can be limited to, right? So now you're telling the judge, or you're giving the judge your own rubric by saying the way that you assess this round is by talking about individual impacts, about how people perceive themselves, how people perceive others, and what's most conducive to happiness, right? So that's how you want to establish impact and relevance within the round. And more specifically, you can frame this question as, what is the best framework for making yourself happier, right? What is the best narrative that helps people make themselves happier given the types of actions that they're likely to engage in? So then the impact that we've got from this is that it's probably messed up to suggest that every single instance wherein people choose to accumulate wealth is immoral, where in many cases this motivation arises out of good intentions. So, for example, we characterize the reality that even when people aren't like obviously poor and like need to accumulate money to like get by, even for people who are like middle class, upper middle class, lower middle class, who have like the sufficient standards of living to like survive and stuff like that, and to like not live a completely uncomfortable life. But we're just saying, why is it a immoral thing for them to want to be better, to secure a larger degree of generational wealth? Why is it bad for them to want to secure more wealth to make their current lives even more comfortable, right? These motivations oftentimes arise out of good intentions, or at the very least, not bad intentions. So to characterize wealth accumulation as immoral, or to have this broad sweeping narrative that wealth accumulation is immoral, is deeply harmful for a lot of these people who choose to engage in this action, right? And you can maybe talk more about or characterize the importance of actions, right? We can talk about how humans inherently have a moralistic view of the actions that they partake in. So, for example, this is why people generally feel happier or they feel, more like I guess like morally superior, for lack of better wording, when they buy from like a local like small business over like Amazon, or when they buy environmentally friendly products, even though they know that the influence that they have on the broader economic system is extremely, extremely, extremely marginal, right? Because regardless of like the impact that this actually has, we still view actions in moralistic lenses. So when you have a narrative or a broad sweeping narrative that maybe characterizes your actions as immoral, that your actions are messed up or something like that, this probably is less conducive for individual human happiness, given the reality that many people pursue these kinds of like actions of wealth accumulation out of like necessity, or do it out of good intentions as well. So this is why narrative level wealth accumulation being immoral is probably a bad thing. And right there, we've established that even though we may not have the broad sweeping policy impacts that government tries to convince the judge to have, we've established for the judge that you don't even need to care about what government says, because all their stuff is kind of like BS, right? Like there's nothing about what they said that there's nothing about their case that is proven to actually happen in the real life. And the second thing is you've established your relevance, right? And I guess like your impact by saying, given that we've constrained this debate to having only impacts on individual people, we've established the most we've established the most significant impacts relative to other teams on individuals and how they view their own actions and how like they make themselves happy and stuff like that. So that's how I, generally speaking, use my strategy of taking away and establishing relevance, or establishing impact or taking away impact in like an actual round. So that's my seminar. It's pretty quick. I don't think there's a need to drag on like something like strategy for so long, because at the end of the day, and like this is like the takeaway thoughts, I guess, is basically strategy is basically just how you win or how you perceive to be better than other teams in this little game that of us trying to convince a singular person that we are the better team, I guess. And this is important as well to remember, because it also influences the rhetoric that you use to frame your arguments. Because if you're not making it accessible or easy for like a judge to repeat to themselves, then it's obviously going to be a lot more difficult for you to win as well. So yeah, that's my seminar. Hope everyone learned something.